Isaiah's been a bit of a pet subject for a while. And the reason is because Isaiah, well, it's 66 chapters. It's such a big book. Actually, it's not the biggest out of the major prophets, to be honest. Jeremiah is actually longer if you count the verses, but it's less chapters, but more verses. But even so, it's a book that's so diverse. It's full of some of the richest, the most beautiful, the most eloquent, poetic words and phrases and descriptions and images you'll find anywhere else in Scripture. And that makes it rather daunting. And it was quite I found it quite daunting and intimidating approaching Isaiah. And I felt that I was a little bit out of my depth and I needed to get some handle on Isaiah. And the reason is because what I discovered is that Isaiah's quoted, other than the Psalms, more than any other book in the New Testament. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that, all the quotes of Isaiah are all found in Revelation. That's why there's more in the New Testament. I don't mean that. I mean that if you take Matthew on its own, Isaiah's quoted more than any other in Matthew's Gospel. If I take Mark on its own, Isaiah's quoted more in just Mark. If I take Luke or Acts or the epistles of Paul quotes from Isaiah more than anywhere else. The words of the Lord Jesus Christ himself quote from Isaiah more than anywhere else, other than the Psalms. And of course, the Psalms, 150 Psalms, you'd expect that. So Isaiah, to me, was the key to understanding the New Testament in many respects. And if I didn't have a handle on Isaiah in some form, how could I expect to get an understanding of the New Testament? So I decided that I would just start dabbling and just an exhort here and there when it came up, and slowly built up a picture, a structure, which I found most helpful. And I really just want to share that with you over the course of the next 6 classes, because it really can't be done any less than that. And we're only going to be skimming across the top. So if you're looking for some drilling down in parts, we can chat about that afterwards. But this is sort of to get you an idea if you were to say, someone mentions Isaiah 45. I know that's in the Book of Comfort section in the first part when they're still in captivity in Babylon. And you can put it in its context. Or, Isaiah 27 or something like that. That's part of the major apocalypse in Isaiah, which follows on from the burdens. And I have found that helpful for myself. So, this is an interesting thought, just to begin. Isaiah's name. Anyone know what Isaiah's name means? So I think that is the key. Say it a bit louder for me. Huh? That's right. The salvation of God. It's actually the other way around. Isaiah, okay? The salvation of God. And I think that's the kernel and the key to the whole book of Isaiah. He's taken the prophet's name and he's going to show how God can save. God can save. He wants to save. In fact, he will save. And the book of Isaiah is going to show how he saves. Okay? So just come to Romans chapter 1, because when you go to the New Testament and say, where's a section that talks about salvation or the atonement? I think most of us would assume that Romans 1 to 8 would be that section. In minute detail, Paul goes through the gospel of salvation. But just note this in verse 1. He says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. He calls it the gospel of God. Yes, Later on in verse 16, this gospel has the power to save. So it is the gospel of salvation, but he calls it the gospel of God. And he says to you in verse 2, which he promised afore by his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So the phrase, the gospel of God, you should be able to go into the Old Testament and find this promised afore by the prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Has anyone gone looking for that phrase, gospel of God, to see where it comes up in the Old Testament, just out of interest? Isaiah 49. Any others? Of Romans? Yeah, I'm saying that Paul's saying he knows they're all in the Old Testament. That's why he's telling you. I went looking for this phrase. I found it only 4 times. Isaiah 61, Isaiah 40, Isaiah 52. Did you say Isaiah 49? Isaiah 40 verse 9. Right, that's good, because that's what I've got down here. So not Isaiah 49, Isaiah 40 verse 9. So if you just want to take note of that, maybe next to Romans chapter 1 there, this phrase, the gospel of God, is all found in Isaiah. And the one that's found elsewhere is actually a quote from Isaiah. If I go off, I haven't got it in my notes. I think it's in Hosea. I can't remember exactly, but it's exactly the same as one of the ones in Isaiah. So yes, there are 4 times, but one of them is quoting from Isaiah in the first place. So 3 times. And let's just take the Isaiah 41. You'll notice they're all in Isaiah 40 to 66. You're going to discover that that's actually the second part of Isaiah. And we're going to be talking about the first part and the second part of Isaiah quite extensively. So Isaiah 40 to 66. These 3 are all found in that section. And just to give you a taste of what I mean, Isaiah 40 verse 9. O Zion that bringest good tidings. There's the word gospel. Right? Good tidings, glad tidings. Good tidings about what? Get thee up into the high mountain, O Jerusalem, that bringest good tidings. There it is again. Lift up thy voice with strength. Lift it up. Be not afraid. Say unto the cities of Judah, behold your God. So the good tidings is about God. So it's the gospel of God. And you'll see that in chapter 52, verse 7, and chapter 61, verse 1 and 2. Gospel of God. And they're all from Isaiah. And Paul goes on and writes Romans 1 to 8, building his case on this phrase, the gospel of God. So Isaiah is really quite an integral part of understanding the gospel of God that can save. And of course, Paul, as we said, goes on to say that in chapter 1 of Romans and verse 16. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to save. And Paul goes to quote from Isaiah on a further 18 occasions in Romans, which is quite extensively if you've coloured in Bible quotes from Old Testaments into the New Testament. 19 times in Romans is quite an extensive amount of quoting from Isaiah. And so Isaiah is the most quoted prophet in the New Testament at every level. So that's why Isaiah is at the beginning of all the prophets. He's the first of the major prophets, and he's the first of all the prophets, including the minor prophets. He's the first prophet. And the interesting thing is that Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the other 3 major prophets, are all fairly contemporary, aren't they? Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, they overlap. Isaiah is 100 years before. So he stands alone. He's been chosen by God to have his message put first in the prophets. He truly was a wonderful man, and he's left on record a most wonderful and intriguing prophecy. So perhaps the first thing to notice then, all right, so his name means the salvation of God. We're going to go through and find out how God can save. The first thing to notice is that Isaiah does have a very rigid structure, and it's very helpful to see this structure. So let's see if we can. Isaiah has two bookends to his whole prophecy, chapter 1 and chapter 66. I'm going to call them the two bookends. So come back to chapter 1. We had that read, and just note some language in chapter 1. I'll put them on the screen for help, for our benefit. So all okay to read? Note some of the things here. So, of course, God is outlining his people. He's unhappy with them. He tells Isaiah to go and speak this message in the ears of my people. So look at verse 1. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So you'd think maybe chapter 1 is going to delve into the visions of Isaiah, the son of Amos. But then you come to chapter 2, verse 1, and you'll see that it starts again with the same words as chapter 1, verse 1. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Doesn't list all the kings' names, but it's hinting, and we're going to suggest it's a hint at the moment, but then when we look at 66, we'll see that chapter 1 is sort of like a standalone. It's going to be a bit of a summary of things that are going to come up later on. And chapter 2 really begins the book. Chapter 1 is a bookend. Maybe a prologue, you might say. So some of the things to notice that we went through, you will notice he talks about, in verse 2, he borrows language from Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. And the heavens and the earth there, okay, are the people, aren't they? And verse 10 tells you that. Hear the word of Yahweh, ye rulers of Sodom. Give ear unto the law of our God, ye people of Gomorrah. So verse 2 and verse 10 are parallel. Hear, O heavens, give ear, O earth. Hear, ye rulers, give ear, ye people. So the heavens are the rulers of the nation. The earth is the people of the nation. Well, what's God's assessment of them? Well, some of the things you would have noticed. Verse 4, are sinful nation. They're a sinful nation. Over in verse 21, how is the faithful city become an harlot? Okay? It's a sinful nation. It's like a harlot. It's described as being leprous, the whole body. It's sick from the head down. Verse 5 tells you that. The whole head is sick and the whole hard heart faint. So, verse 11 says, to what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith Yahweh? I am full of the burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. Okay? Verse 12, when you come to appear before me, who hath required this at your hand to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations. So So all of those burnt offerings you're bringing of rams, the fat of beasts, I don't want them anymore. I don't like them because they're not representing what I intended them to represent. Verse 13 goes on to say that incense is an abomination. All right, so that's point number 2 up there, or number 3. Incense is an abomination. So all the sacrifices I don't like, stop bringing them. And incense, which is supposed to be that sweet-smelling savour of prayer ascending to God, he says it's an abomination. And then he says in verse 15, and when you spread forth your hands, I'm going to hide my eyes from you. I'm not going to see him. And when you make many prayers, I will not hear. I'm going to close my ears. And then in verse 13 and 14, I've put this out of sequence because of the way it fits in chapter 66. But in verse 13 and 14, he says, I want you to stop your new moons, your Sabbaths, and your appointed feasts. I don't like them. I hate them, actually, he says. Well, come to chapter 66 and see all of this come up again at the other end of the book. And I'll put them up on the slide and you'll be able to pick them up and see them. So what did we say verse 1 started with? Or verse 2? It's actually verse 2, isn't it? Give ear, O heavens, and hear, O earth. It was verse 2, wasn't it, in chapter 1? But in chapter 66, he says, Thus saith Yahweh, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. In fact, in verse 22, for as the new heavens and the new earth, he refers to the heavens and the earth again. Okay? But in doing so, in chapter 66, verse 3, he describes what he's continuing to see, which he doesn't like. Because he says in verse 3, he that killeth an ox, like for a sacrifice, like a burnt offering or something like that, is like he's slew a man. I mean, if you kill a man, God hates that. So I don't like your sacrifice of killing an ox. He that sacrificeth a lamb is like he that's cut off a dog's neck. He that offereth an oblation is as if he's offered swine's blood. That's the very same thing as he said back in chapter 1, verse 11. To what purpose is your multitude of sacrifices? All of these things. I don't like them. Well, he gets to the end of Isaiah in chapter 60, and he's saying the same thing. What did it say about incense in chapter 1? Incense is an abomination. Well, chapter 66, verse 3, it goes on, he that burneth incense, that sweet-smelling savour, is like he's blessing an idol. God hates it. In chapter 1, he said, when you spread forth your hands, I will not see. When you pray, I will not hear. In chapter 66, it's the same language, but it's in reverse. Did you notice? Verse 4 says, because when I called, none did answer. When I spake, they did not hear. That's really the same consequence as chapter 1, verse 15. You spread your hands, I will not see. Why? Because when I called to you, you wouldn't hear me. And so this is mutual. You wouldn't listen to me, so I didn't listen to you. Now, before I look at the next one, which you'll notice is now actually one of the few that is a positive change from chapter 1. From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, come over to verse 23, shall all flesh come to worship before me. That is a change from chapter 1. So there are some changes, but there's a lot of similarities. And what sort of intrigued me was that you start in chapter 1, everything's bad. And you think, God's going to save. He's going to show us his salvation. And you think, let's weave our way through this book. We go through all of the sections. We get through to the chapters on Hezekiah. We get into the second half and we come to chapter 66 as if to expect that this would be the chapter about how God saved everybody. And yet it's not like that. And it looks like, on the surface, that nothing's changed from chapter 1 to chapter 66. Flesh is still acting like flesh. And God hates it. And God is describing his hatred in just as strong language as he did in chapter 1. And all through Isaiah, it speaks about God intervening all through the lives of Uzziah, of Ahaz, of Hezekiah. And has that made any mark, any difference? Well, you come to chapter 66 and it looks like it doesn't. It looks like nothing's changed. And yet the truth is, and I hope to show this over the next few weeks, that everything has changed, actually. Everything has changed. And God can and he will save. And so you get this very small description of where things have changed in some areas. But it shows that not everybody is going to be saved. Just because Isaiah's name means the salvation of God, and just because everyone's bad there, doesn't mean everyone's going to be good at the end of chapter 66. So I think this probably is what helped me see what's really going on. Come back to chapter 1. Keep your hand in chapter 66. There's one word that's found in chapter 1 that gets repeated in chapter 66 and isn't found anywhere else. And it's right at the beginning of chapter 1 and it's right at the end of chapter 66. So let's just read verse 2 again. All right? Remind me afterwards to change that verse to verse 2. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for Yahweh hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. This word rebelled is the Hebrew word pasha or pasha. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced. It means to offend, to rebel, to revolt, to transgress. It's showing the worst that God hates. My children have rebelled against me. Now come to chapter 66. Right at the end of chapter 66, this word comes up again, and it tells you quite plainly what's happened to those who have rebelled. This is what salvation looks like. Salvation is getting rid of this element of rebellion in people. So here it is in verse 24. So remember I said first verse, pretty much. Last verse, this word pasha. So we'll just read verse 23 again because that was on our list as one of the positive changes. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Yahweh. So up they come to worship properly. And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have rebelled against me. That word transgressed is the word pasha, and it means to rebel. For their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. So the rebellious are removed. That's God's plan of salvation. The rebels of the first verse of the book are dealt with once and for all in the final verse of the book. And we've got to go all the way through Isaiah to see how that happens. Does that make sense? That's what Isaiah is going to do. And you sort of think, Paul does it in chapter 1 to 8 of Romans. Well, he condenses everything down from Isaiah. Isaiah is going to show it's not quite clear-cut, as you might think. There's quite a process involved. And there's 2 stages to it, hence 2 parts to Isaiah. Okay. Hence, between chapters 1 and 66 is the process of salvation to those who choose to accept it. That's what I've got as a summary of looking at that word. Now, this next slide, some of you may agree with this, some of you may not, but going through this, I have come to the conclusion that Isaiah really is written chronologically. Others will suggest that it jumps back and forth and it goes forward, then it comes back. But I think looking at the structure demonstrates that it's chronological. Some clues to start with are there on the screen, and we'll be building on this as we go through our classes. Remember, there were 4 kings mentioned in chapter 1, which would be the time period that Isaiah would prophesy. They are Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Well, Uzziah, Ahaz, and Hezekiah are mentioned in Isaiah, but Jotham is not. I have a suggestion as to why he's not. I was listening to Brother John Carter's talks on Isaiah. I think he gets up to chapter 36 or something like that. And he makes a suggestion, which I followed up, that Jotham was never a sole ruler in his own right. He was always co-regent. Co-regent. Remember, Uzziah became leprous and so went into his leprous house set apart. Jotham took over. Jotham was co-regent. But this suggestion is that Jotham died before Uzziah died. And so Ahaz became co-regent until Uzziah died, and then Ahaz was sole ruler in his own right. Now that bit of information came from Murray's Bible Dictionary, which Brother John Carter referred to. I found it quite hard to find it, but I did find it online. And since then, I found some other commentators that make a similar suggestion. So therefore, what kings are mentioned are kings in their own right. Okay, and that's where Isaiah is going to speak to them as the ruler of the nation, because they are the top of the nation. And Jotham actually was a good king in the main. He was a good king in the main. Uzziah dies in chapter 6, verse 1, in the year that King Uzziah died. So we're introduced to Uzziah. That was the first king in the list in chapter 1. That brings Ahaz on the scene. Why? Because the suggestion is that Jotham has already died. So he doesn't take the throne next after Uzziah dies. Ahaz does. And then in chapter 14 and verse 28, it says, in the year that King Ahaz died. So Ahaz then dies, and that's chronologically flowing on from Uzziah. So who takes over after Ahaz? Well, Hezekiah. And chapter 15 to 39 is suggested. And then, of course, there is the section dealing with Hezekiah in chapter 36, 37, 38, and 39, which does mention Hezekiah. But from chapter 15 to chapter 39 is all about the build-up to Hezekiah, the good king that's coming, Hezekiah. Then chapter 40 to 65 jumps forward about 100 years to the captivity, because suddenly you get language in chapter 40 to 48 of them being in Babylon. They're in Babylon, and you get references to Cyrus coming, don't you? The promised deliverer, Cyrus. You get references to Bel and Nebo. They can't help you. Bel and Nebo were gods of Babylon. Maybe, depending on how we go, might not get to this quote later on, but just come to chapter 48, verse 20. So chapter 40 to 48, they're in Babylon. And then in verse 20, you get told that they're in Babylon because verse 20 of chapter 48 says, "Go ye forth of Babylon, flee ye from the Chaldeans." Get out of there. All right, so we've jumped ahead to the captivity. That's about 100 years after the time of Isaiah. And a lot of commentators out there in the world say this can't be Isaiah because he didn't live during these days. And they don't believe in inspiration, and they don't believe the ability for God to give visions that predict the future. And so they say this has to be something to do with Hezekiah, or it has to be something to do with, and they jump back. I don't have a problem with God giving visions or telling Isaiah what's going to happen in the future so that God's people can be armed with this information so that when they're in Babylon and they've got Isaiah's prophecy there, they can read about Cyrus. And suddenly there he is outside the city walls. And they say, we know about him. We've been told about him. So go out of Babylon. Chapter 49 to chapter 55, there's language here about them coming home. And it's still a wasteland. Okay, the city's still got burnt out walls and the gates aren't sort of working properly. Come over to chapter 52 and verse 11. Depart ye, go ye out from thence, touch no unclean thing. Go ye out of the midst of her, be ye clean that bear the vessels of Yahweh. So that's the language of coming out, that are bearing the vessels of Yahweh. So they're coming home, you see. Remember in Daniel 5, the vessels of Yahweh were being brought out and abused by Belshazzar. And so God that night judged Belshazzar. And then Cyrus comes on the throne and he says, you can all go back and you can take the vessels of God with you. Well, here they are. They're coming back. They're coming back. All right. Come back to the waste places of Jerusalem. Back in verse 9, break forth into joy, sing together, ye waste places of Jerusalem. For Yahweh hath comforted his people, he hath redeemed Jerusalem. So they're not in Babylon, they're coming back, they're bringing the vessels back. And then in chapter 56 to 66, suddenly you get a change of language again. And this time the language describes Jerusalem as a fully built city. The gates are there. There are watchmen on the gates. There's temple worship. There's Sabbath keeping. There's priests. There's ministers in the house of God. 56 to 66, or 66 is the bookend, so 56 to 65 is all about now re-established in Jerusalem. We're talking the days of Nehemiah and beyond. In fact, I believe we're talking in this section particularly about Nehemiah right through down to the days of the Lord Jesus Christ. So about a period of 400 years, and God's going to describe what they were like during that period of time as well. So that's my take, that it's to be seen chronological. One way to sort of maybe help put this in a little bit of context. Isaiah is a prophecy, but it has some stories in it. Anyone know which chapters are the story chapters, the narrative chapters, the prose chapters? If you were to count them out, anyone be able to give some suggestions? You know what I mean by prose, by narrative? Isaiah's not writing it, he's actually a participant in the story. So that's chapters 36 to 39, okay? That's the major one. That's where the division happens. But it's not the only one. There are some others, and what the others show is that the whole book is actually structured in looking at things in two halves very often. Okay, anyone know where some of the others are? Chapter 8, but it starts in chapter 7. It's dealing with Ahaz, and it's a story. And Isaiah is sent to Ahaz. And Ahaz says, I will not ask for a sign. So it goes from chapter 7, verse 1 to chapter 8, verse, I think it's 20, but I haven't got it here in my notes. It'll be on the screen later. Chapter 6, Isaiah is in a story. Okay, Isaiah has just died, and it's narrative. And there's actually one more as well. It's a small one tucked away, and it's only 6 verses, and you think, what is that doing? It's chapter 20. Isaiah is told to walk barefoot for 3 years, six verses. He's a participant in the story. Well, we'll get to the big one in a moment. There's this one in chapter 6 and 7. And in chapter 6 and 7, we are introduced to 2 bad kings. I've just mentioned Isaiah is in chapter 6 and Ahaz is in chapter 7. 3 points about Isaiah in chapter 6. We know that he was struck with leprosy because he was proud. All right, and God struck him. He wanted to be a king, which he was, and he wanted to be a priest. He had the same name as the high priest, so therefore, why can't I be priest too? He wanted to be a king, priest. And how many priests was it that stopped him? I think it was 80, if I remember. 80 priests said, you can't do this. All right, yes, I can, he's going. And he was so proud, he stood his ground, and he was smitten with leprosy at that moment, wasn't he? Right in the forehead. Proud, because he had become strong. So he went to the temple in pride, he was smitten with leprosy, and he was leprous until the day of his death. Well, Isaiah is going to write his prophecy with the anticipation and the excitement of a far better king to come than Isaiah was. And in the first instance, it's Hezekiah. But of course, Hezekiah becomes a type of the Lord Jesus Christ. And in chapter 38 and 39, which is the second part of the 4 chapters dealing with those stories of Hezekiah, oh, that is wrong. I didn't change that. It shouldn't be in pride. I've obviously just copied and pasted over with the intention of changing it. What did Hezekiah go to the temple in chapter 38? When he was told, set your house in order, you've got 15 years. He went to the temple in sackcloth, okay, which is the complete opposite of pride. He went to the temple in sackcloth. We suggest he was smitten with leprosy. Isaiah 53, we'll get to that later in the series. And I clearly have just copied and pasted without changing that at all. That is bad on my part. He was actually cured after heartfelt prayer. He was cured after heartfelt prayer. So sort of look at that screen like that and cover your right eye, all right? And I'll tell you what it should be on the right-hand side. He went to the temple in sackcloth. He was smitten with an incurable disease, which we suggest was leprosy, and he was cured after heartfelt prayer. So there's the better king coming. You can see why he's a better king. What about chapter 7? What about Ahaz? Well, Ahaz was arrogant. It wasn't just pride. His sheer arrogancy. I will not ask for a sign. I will not tempt the Lord God, he says. What was the situation surrounding Ahaz? Well, the house of David was being threatened by Syria and Assyria in the north, threatening to wipe him out. And of course, he's only a young boy. He's got no son of his own. Uzziah's died, Jotham's died. The house of David was being threatened with elimination through war. And God says, ask for a sign. He said, I'm not going to. So that's the bad king. What do you know about Hezekiah? Phew, I have changed that one. That's good. Slightly on the ball. Well, with Hezekiah, the house of David again was in that chapter, in chapter 38:9, being threatened with elimination through sickness. Hezekiah was being told, 15 years, you'll die, and he had no son, did he? And what did he do? Well, he asked God for a sign. And of course, the sundial was the sign that he asked, about the sundial going back 10 degrees. 10 degrees. I've always got the number 15 and the number 10. But it's 10 degrees, isn't it? And here's Isaiah writing about the anticipation of the better king, because he knows that Hezekiah is a type of the Messiah to come. Now, I'm going to just skip past those and get to this part first, and then come back if we've got time. Okay, I want to sort of get you into the thinking of the structure, because that's just a small taste in chapter 6 and 7 of two stories in between chapter 2 to 12. Chapter 2 to 12 has two stories stuck in between two halves. So chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then you come to chapter 6, one story. Then you come to chapter 7, another story. It goes into chapter 8. And then you get 9, 10, 11, and 12. And what you find is that the things found in chapter 6 are all the things found in chapter 2 to 5. And the things in chapter 7 and 8 are all the things found in chapter 9, 10, and 11, and 12. And what that is doing is copying the big structure of Isaiah, because this is what it looks like. The big structure of Isaiah has what I'm going to call a hinge that holds the two halves of Isaiah together. Now, I'm a carpenter. I do kitchens and carpentry, and so I know how a hinge works. You know how a hinge works. One part of the hinge is on the door, the other part of the hinge is on the frame. Okay, and so the hinge is an independent part of the door and the frame. Well, here's our hinge. Chapter 36 to 39, 4 chapters, but it's really 2 stories, and the 2 stories happen at the same time in history. You've got to work out the timings of that. I'm going to just ask you to accept that, okay? The first story is a crisis where Jerusalem was besieged by the Assyrians. And God gives them a sign, okay, about there being, I'm going to have to read it because I can't remember it off by heart. Give you a sign. Verse 30 of chapter 37. And this shall be a sign. Ye shall eat this year, such as groweth of itself, and the second year, that which springeth of the same, and the third year, that's when you will sow. I'll give you a sign. And then he wrought some marvelous victory. 185,000 Assyrians die. Story 1 finished. But at the very same time, another story was happening, but it's written as if it's an independent story, but it's happening at the same time, and there's another crisis. This time, it's not Jerusalem surrounded by Sennacherib, it's Hezekiah on his deathbed, and God gives another sign. God gives a sign of the sundial going back. God wrought a marvelous recovery, and Hezekiah welcomes the Babylonians. Now, what you find what you find is that in the first half of Isaiah, Assyria is the dominant power. There's really not much mention of the Babylonians or any other power. Egypt's there for a bit as a potential dominant power, but it's Assyria that's the dominant power. But in the second half, Babylon is the dominant power. And we already showed you references to Babylon. Assyria is not mentioned in the second half. And it's like as if this hinge is giving you the narrative of what the prophecies are all about in the first half and the second half. So the hinge, the first part of the hinge, is about being besieged by the Assyrians and God delivering them from Assyria. Well, that's what the whole of the first half is about. The second part of the hinge is about a crisis, God giving a sign, showing deliverance, and then the Babylonians come in and Hezekiah shows them all his house. And so now God says, now I have to show you how to be saved from the Babylonians. And the whole of the second half is about how God's going to save them from the Babylonians. Two very distinct sections. In fact, so distinct that some people say it's a different Isaiah that wrote the second half to that which wrote the first half, because the language seems so different. All right? To highlight the differences even more, in the first half, you get references to kingship. All right, we've already seen Uzziah the king. We've already seen Ahaz the king. We've already seen Hezekiah the king. Okay? If the focus is on kingship, the word king occurs 23 times in the first half. The word king occurs, I think it's only 4 times in the second half, if I remember. Barely at all. What you get is no longer the word king, you get the word servant. And it's not about kingship, it's about service. The word servant only occurs 1 time in the first half. All right, so the focus is on kingship, you see. And the word servant occurs 20 times, and the word servants occurs 11 times. And when we get to that section, you'll see an even greater definition. The word servant is only in that section from 40 to 55, never servants. And then the word servants is from 56 to 66, and never the word servant. So there's a progression from servant to servants. So God is going to show in this prophecy that there's a need for deliverance from Assyria and from Babylon. But the way to be delivered from Assyria is all about kingship, and the way to be delivered from Babylon is all going to be through service. And you can't get anyone higher than a king, can you? He is at the top, and you can't get anyone lower than a servant. So here's an interesting thing. In the first half then, it's quite surprising on the surface, but once you find out why, there are 4 prophecies of the coming king. Chapter 9, 11, 32, and 33. Sort of like they bookend the first half, the 4 prophecies of the coming king. But in the second half, and you probably know these ones even more, you get 4 prophecies of the coming servant. The servant prophecies, chapter 42, 49, 50, and 53. I just think that really helps to just paint out why this structure looks like this. So, can I just go back a minute? Some words to note that just come up in the second half, which are barely mentioned in the first half, so that you get an idea of how distinct the change is. The word comfort only occurs in chapter 12 in the first half. There's no comfort in the first half. It's all judgment, you see. I've entitled it the Book of Judgment. It's all about a king showing judgment, because that's what a king does. He gets his army and he's going to come and he's going to judge. Right? He's going to punish. And Sennacherib was trying to do that. He did it to Lachish and he's trying to do it to Jerusalem. And God says, no. Hezekiah is going to be the greater king in this scenario. He's going to judge the Assyrians. And through Hezekiah, God judged the Assyrians. Kingship, leadership. But Babylon's a different story. Babylon was where you had lots of comfort, because Babylon was a place where everybody wanted to live. They didn't want to kill you like the Assyrians, okay? The Babylonians were friendly people, and they'd give you a 3-story house in Babylon. They say that the houses in Babylon were 3 stories high. They even had running water in the kitchen. They had universities. You send your kids to university. They trained them up, and life was good. We had so much creature comforts in Babylon. And God comes along through Isaiah and says, I want to provide you comfort. And those in Babylon said, what do you mean, give us comfort? We've got it pretty good here. We don't need saving from Babylon. Can you see how the differences are between Babylon and Assyria? So you get phrases like comfort, salvation, joy, redeem, light. The Gentiles, we come up in the second half, brothers and sisters. We don't get mentioned much in the first half. One time, Isaiah chapter 11. 14 times in the second half. So quite a distinct change. And so you might have heard of some people calling the second half being written by what they call Juto Isaiah, second Isaiah, because it can't be the same. It's just so different. No, it's just because Assyria and Babylon are different. So God has to deal with them differently. But it's still God's salvation, you see. So, just thought I would leave this with you. Why Assyria and Babylon? Why are those two the dominant powers? What's God trying to teach us? Well, you probably know this through doing studies on Daniel and reading Brother John Thomas with the exposition on Daniel and such like, that Assyria and Babylon are really one power in 2 phases. They have their beginnings back in Genesis 10. Genesis 10, Nimrod, the mighty hunter, went out and built Babylon. 4 cities. Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. He went and built Babylon. Then he went and built Assyria. Again, 4 cities, Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, and Rezin. All right? Identical. Assyria and Babylon. The kingdom of men is seen in the Assyro-Babylonian Empire built by Nimrod. And that's what Brother Thomas calls it, if you remember. The Assyro-Babylonian Empire. But come to Daniel. Come to Daniel chapter 7. Because Jeremiah the prophet said that the lions would come and destroy Israel. First, the Assyrian lion, then the Babylonian lion. 2 phases, but both called lions. In Daniel 7 and verse 4, it says, the first was like a lion that had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon the feet as a man. And a man's heart was given to it. So it started off on all 4s and it had wings. Suddenly the wings are plucked out and it stands up and a man's heart's given to it. 2 phases. Okay? Why? Because the power of sin, the kingdom of men, is seen in two aspects. And salvation is dependent on both being conquered to win the battle over the seed of the serpent. And so the first aspect of Assyria, I'm going to call the brutal power of sin. But Babylon is the friendly power of sin. Because the first lion looked like a lion. Okay, it had eagle's wings, but if you looked at it, it growled and it was on all fours and it had the tail swishing, ready to pounce. It was a lion that looked like a lion, ferocious. It wants to eat you. The next phase, the lion changes to try and look like a man. And so it wants to get up beside you and put its paw around you and pretend to be your friend. But you know it's still a lion, but it doesn't look quite like the lion. All right, this lion wants to be your friend. And the way in which to deal with sin, God's going to show, is the brutal power of sin, the one, and if you've been to the London British Museum and went to the Lakeish room, you will see the way the Assyrians treated people was brutal, right? On that Lakeish wall, they've got captives with their tongues cut out. They've got them pierced on a pole and stuck up on outside the walls. Okay, they displaced you and put you into another part of the empire, never allowed to return home. All right, they were brutal people. How do you deal with the brutal power of sin? Well, we're going to see that in the first half. You've got to deal with it with leadership. But Babylon was very different. They didn't cut your tongue out. They didn't put you on a pole. They sent you to university and they gave running water in your kitchen. They looked after you. They wanted to be your friend. But they were as deadly as anything in taking you away from God. They were still as sinful as Assyria, but it was harder to recognize because you felt good. So God's going to show that the way to conquer that form of sin, the friendly face of sin, is by choosing who you want to serve. Do you want to serve this world? Do you want to serve Babylon? Or do you want to serve God? And so Jesus Christ came along and he's going to be both a king and a servant, conquering both forms of sin. So that's all I had for tonight. So I'll just leave you with this. This is where we're going throughout our 6 classes. Next class, we're going to look at chapter 2 to 12 and just get a taste. We already had a look at it a little bit tonight of the book of Emmanuel, chapter 2 to 12, with those 2 stories in the middle. The next class is going to look at the book of burdens, which is chapter 13 to 27. There are 10 burdens, and then there's this section called, I'm going to say, the major apocalypse, a tale of 2 cities. Then we're going to look, the next class, at the book of woes, which goes from chapter 28 to 35, which has a little apocalypse, the tale of 2 lands. And then we're going to do 2 parts on the book of comfort, chapter 40 to 55 in our 5th, and then chapter 56 to 66 in our 6th class, the book of comfort, part 1 and 2. So I hope that's given you an indication of what we are trying to do, and come up and have a chat. I'd love to hear what your studies on Isaiah have been, but thanks for your attention tonight.